What if the most influential console in gaming history never actually shipped? What if the device that reshaped an entire industry altered the balance of power between the biggest corporations on Earth and triggered a chain of decisions that still echoes in every game you play today? Never once sat on a store shelf. That is not a hypothetical. That is the documented, verifiable history of canceled hardware. And the story is stranger, more deliberate, and more consequential than most people realize. What you are about to hear is the history the industry does not put in press releases. These are the projects that died in boardrooms, in legal disputes, in the private ambitions of engineers who never got credit, and yet shaped everything that came after them. Let us start where the chaos begins. In 1994, Sega had a problem. The company had just launched the 32X add-on, a unit that plugged into the existing Genesis console and theoretically boosted its processing power into 32-bit territory. The hardware worked. Developers were building for it, but the 32X required consumers to already own a Genesis, which created an obvious barrier to entry. Sega's engineers had the logical solution ready. Build a standalone unit that combined the Genesis and the 32X into a single self-contained console. They called it the Neptune. According to Sega's internal hardware documentation, referenced in detail in Blake J. Harris's book Console Wars, a fully functioning Neptune prototype existed by late 1994. It was not a concept sketch. It was not a render. It was a working machine, ready for manufacturing evaluation. And Sega killed it, not because of a technical failure, but because of a calendar. The Saturn was coming. Sega's next-generation console was scheduled to launch, and the executives running the company realized a fundamental problem. If the Neptune shipped and sold well, it would cannibalize Saturn's potential market. Why would a consumer spend more money on a new platform when a cheaper, polished unit had just arrived? The Neptune would eat its own company's future. The decision was made internally, quietly, and entirely outside of public view. The Neptune never received a single press release. It was never announced. It simply ceased to exist as a product, known only to the engineers who built it and the executives who canceled it. And here is what makes this genuinely strange. Working Neptune prototypes have since surfaced in the collector market, with authenticated units selling at heritage auctions for over $10,000. A console that never officially existed is now a documented artifact of hardware history. But the Neptune's story, as consequential as it is almost simple compared to what happened between Nintendo and Sony, and what that falling out created. Most people know the PlayStation exists. Far fewer know how close it came to never existing at all, and fewer still know that it began as an unauthorized employee side project. Ken Kutaragi was a Sony engineer in the late 1980s. He was not a senior executive. He did not have the authority to commit Sony to a major hardware partnership. What he had was technical expertise, access to Sony's internal engineering resources, and an understanding of something Nintendo needed: a dedicated audio processing chip for its Super Nintendo hardware. Kutaragi approached Nintendo. He helped develop the Sony-designed sound chip that shipped in every Super Nintendo console. But he did not stop there. He saw a larger opportunity: a joint venture in which Sony would develop a CD-ROM add-on for the Super Nintendo, giving Nintendo's platform expanded storage capacity and Sony a foothold in consumer gaming hardware. According to the account documented in the IEE Annals of the History of Computing, and corroborated by Kutaragi's own interviews in Nikkei Electronics, Kutaragi presented this proposal to Nintendo, without Sony's board of directors knowing the project existed. He had essentially run an unauthorized negotiation on behalf of his company, and when Sony's leadership found out, they nearly fired him. The project survived only because of the intervention of Sony's then-president, Norio Okada, who recognized its strategic potential and gave Kutaragi protection. The joint development proceeded. Sony built what became known as the PlayStation, a Super Nintendo variant with a built-in CD-ROM drive. 200 units were manufactured for trade show demonstration in 1991. And then Nintendo did something that changed the entire trajectory of the industry. At the Consumer Electronics Show in 1991, Sony showcased the PlayStation device. The following morning, deliberately the morning after, Nintendo announced it had signed a separate partnership with Philips for a CD-ROM solution. The public humiliation was intentional. Nintendo's leadership had decided the licensing terms in Sony's original contract gave Sony too much control over software published on the CD format, and rather than renegotiate, they walked. They announced the Philips deal in a way specifically designed to undercut Sony's moment in the spotlight. The contract dispute centered on content licensing rights. Under the original terms, Sony retained significant control over any titles released on the CD-ROM format, an arrangement Nintendo found unacceptable as it better understood what that would mean for publisher relationships. When the deal collapsed, Sony was left with a hardware development investment, a team of engineers, and a strategic ambition that had nowhere to go. Kutaragi redirected that ambition. Sony's board, now fully aware of the gaming division, authorized a standalone console project. What had begun as a Nintendo accessory became a direct competitor. The original PlayStation launched in Japan in 1994 and redefined the console market. One authenticated prototype of the Nintendo PlayStation, the device that started everything, sold at our auction in March of 2020 for $360,000. The Philips deal, by the way, produced the CDI, which is now remembered primarily as the source of some of the most critically derided licensed games ever made. Now consider what happens when a company faces a different kind of internal resistance, not a contract dispute with a partner, but opposition from its own leadership. In the late 1990s, a group of engineers and developers at Microsoft were convinced the company needed to enter the gaming console market. The threat, as they saw it, was Sony's PlayStation and the possibility that the living room television, already becoming a hub for entertainment, would become a platform Sony controlled. If that happened, Microsoft's operating system dominance in personal computing would mean nothing in the spaces where consumers actually spent their leisure time. The team that proposed the Xbox faced a problem with a very specific name: Bill Gates. According to the internal oral history published by Xbox Wire and supplemented by journalist Dean Takahashi's detailed account in opening the Xbox, Gates personally opposed the console project 3 separate times in internal reviews between 1999 and 2000. His position was consistent. It was a distraction from enterprise software. Microsoft's value was in productivity, operating systems, and corporate infrastructure. A gaming console was not that. What ultimately moved Gates was not enthusiasm for gaming. It was the same strategic logic that had motivated the original pitch. The threat that Sony, if unchecked, would own the living room operating environment. The Xbox was approved as a defensive move. The technical decisions that followed reflect the circumstances of its creation. The original Xbox used a custom version of Windows 2000, stripped to a kernel footprint under 10 megabytes. The DirectX team pushed for a personal computer architecture specifically because it would make software porting straightforward. Developers who already built games for Windows-based computers could move to Xbox with manageable effort. That architectural choice, born from deadline pressure and the need to attract developers quickly, established the technical lineage that the Xbox platform still follows. Gates opposed it 3 times. The console shipped anyway. It eventually became one of the 2 dominant platforms in a market that Gates had called a distraction. But not every internal opposition ends in eventual success. Some projects die because the opposition wins. And some of those dead projects leave consequences that last decades. Nintendo's 64DD was a magnetic disk drive add-on for the Nintendo 64 console. The concept was legitimate. The add-on would allow games to be distributed on a readable disk format with significantly more storage than a standard cartridge, enabling a new category of content. Persistent online worlds, downloadable expansions, titles too large for cartridge-based distribution. The 64DD was announced before the Nintendo 64 itself launched in 1996, positioned as a simultaneous release that would expand the platform's capabilities from day one. According to Media Create Japan sales data from the first quarter of 2000, the device finally launched in Japan in December of 1999. 3 years after the console it was designed to accompany. The delay was total market failure, fewer than 15,000 units sold in Japan. The 64DD never reached North America or Europe, and the titles that had been designed around its capabilities, including major projects from Rare, Square, and Capcom, had not waited. Those developers had spent years watching the 64DD slip from deadline to deadline. During that window, the PlayStation was building its library and its installed user base. The analysis documented in David Sheffa's updated edition of Game Over describes what happened next as a third-party exodus. Developers who had committed resources to Nintendo 64 development began shifting production priorities to PlayStation. Square did not simply release Final Fantasy VII on PlayStation because of a preference for the format. They moved because the cartridge format's storage limitations and the 64 DDIA's perpetual delays made the Nintendo 64 impractical for the scope of game they wanted to build. That migration, Rare, Square, Capcom, and others redirecting major franchises towards Sony's platform, changed the competitive landscape of the entire console generation and established PlayStation as the dominant creative platform of its era. Nintendo has never fully rebuilt those third-party relationships to their pre-64 DD state. The cost of a 3-year delay in a peripheral that sold 15,000 units was, in competitive terms, incalculable. There is a pattern in these stories of technical ambition colliding with institutional inertia, of decisions made in executive offices cascading into consequences no one predicted. And sometimes the consequences go in an unexpected direction, not market failure, but deliberate deception. The Atari Jaguar launched in 1993 with an aggressive marketing campaign built around a single specific claim, 64-bit. The tagline was "Do the math." The implication was generational superiority, a console so far beyond its competitors that the arithmetic alone made the case. The Atari Jaguar Technical Reference Manual, publicly archived through the Atari Age Developer Resources, tells a different story. The Jaguar's primary central processing unit, the Motorola 68000, was a 16 and 32-bit chip. The 64-bit claim derived from the combined data bus width of two custom coprocessors Atari had designed internally, named Tom and Jerry. Those coprocessors could, in theory, process 64 bits of data simultaneously. In practice, as Digital Foundry's retrospective analysis documented, developers had to manually coordinate Tom and Jerry through assembly-level programming, with no abstraction layer to simplify the process. Most development teams, working under commercial deadlines and without the specialized expertise the architecture demanded, produced games that effectively ran at 32-bit or lower performance levels. The hardware's theoretical ceiling existed. Almost no shipped title reached it. Atari's own developer documentation acknowledged the complexity. The marketing was never retracted. The 64-bit claim continued to appear on packaging and in advertising throughout the console's commercial life. This was not a gray area or a matter of interpretation. The company's internal technical resources contradicted what the public-facing marketing stated, and the company sold the product anyway. The Jaguar was discontinued in 1996 after selling an estimated 150,000 units in North America. Now, let us talk about something that most people interact with every day without knowing its origin, and an origin that reveals just how reactive the industry can be when it feels threatened. Every game sold in North America carries a rating from the Entertainment Software Rating Board. The classification system is so standardized, so embedded in retail and parental expectations, that it is easy to assume it emerged from some deliberate, thoughtful policy process. It did not. On December 9, 1993, the United States Senate held a hearing on violence in video games. Senator Joe Lieberman was among those who presented footage of Mortal Kombat, the arcade port that home consoles had released with varying approaches to its content, alongside footage from Night Trap, a full-motion video game that featured simulated attacks on young women. The hearing was designed to demonstrate that the game industry was selling violent content to children without restriction. What the congressional record from that hearing, number 16254, also documents is this. The Senate had already drafted legislation to establish a government-operated federal ratings board. The proposal was serious. It had sponsorship. The industry was looking at the possibility of a federal agency with the authority to classify and potentially restrict game content, a form of government oversight with no precedent in commercial entertainment software. According to the founding timeline documented in Harold Goldberg's All Your Base Are Belong to Us, the Entertainment Software Rating Board was created in under 6 months as a direct preemptive response. The industry created its own rating system specifically to demonstrate self-regulation and eliminate the political justification for federal intervention. The ESRB was not a thoughtful long-term policy initiative. It was a defensive organizational structure built at speed to make a congressional bill unnecessary. The ratings categories you see on every game box today, from everyone to adults only, are the product of an industry moving as fast as it legally could to avoid government control of its content. And then there is the story that connects two of the most recognizable names in modern graphics hardware. A story of acquisition, intellectual property, and a company legally buying back technology it had not originally invented. In 1998, a company called 3DFX released the Voodoo 2 graphics processing unit. The Voodoo 2 introduced a multi-GPU rendering technique called scanline interleave, which allowed 2 graphics cards to divide the rendering workload by processing alternating horizontal lines of the display simultaneously. The result was a meaningful performance increase without requiring a single more powerful chip. The technology worked, and the gaming hardware community recognized it. 3DFX filed the scanline interleave patent, United States patent number 5,740,343, in 1996, and it was granted in the years following. In 2000, Nvidia acquired 3DFX's assets for $70 million. The acquisition documented in Nvidia's Securities and Exchange Commission filing from December 15th of that year specifically included 3DFX's patent portfolio. Among those patents was scanline interleave. In 2004, Nvidia introduced a multi-GPU technology for its own graphics hardware. They called it Scalable Link Interface. Sly, the underlying concept, 2 graphics cards dividing the rendering workload, was the same technology that 3DFX had patented 8 years earlier. Nvidia had purchased the legal right to use and rebrand the technology from a company it had absorbed. The industry press covered the Sly relaunch as an Nvidia innovation. The 3DFX origin was almost entirely absent from mainstream coverage. The $70 million acquisition had purchased, among other things, the intellectual foundation of a product line Nvidia would market for years as its own. Every one of the stories in this video follows a version of the same logic. An engineer hides a project from his bosses and creates the PlayStation. A company cancels a working console to protect a future platform and creates the Neptune. A delay of 3 years in a peripheral that barely sells triggers a third-party exodus that reshapes an entire console generation. A senator holds a hearing, and within 6 months a self-regulatory organization is created that persists for decades. A company spends $70 million to acquire, among other things, a patent for technology it will then relaunch under a different name. The gaming and technology industry presents itself through product launches and press releases, controlled moments of officially sanctioned narrative. But the actual history is made in the decisions that never get announced. The projects that die before anyone outside a boardroom knows they existed. The moments where one engineer's ambition or one executive's veto point changed everything. That history is what this channel is built to document. Not the version that the press releases tell, the version the records show. If that is the kind of history you want to understand, this is where it gets told.